Welcome to Compact Warfare from compactwarfare.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 49, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. In the autumn of the year 9 CE, 3 Roman legions marched through the wooded hills and marshy tracts east of the Rhine, burdened with baggage animals, families of camp followers, and a false sense of security. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, believed he was pacifying a settled province. Their guide, Arminius of the Cherusci, was a Roman-trained auxiliary officer who had decided that the moment had come to turn Rome's discipline and predictability against it. Over 3 days of rain, mud, and repeated ambushes, the legions were cut to pieces. The disaster in Teutoburg Forest shocked Augustus, reshaped Roman frontier policy for generations, and forged a story that later centuries would turn into legend. In the decades before the battle, Rome pressed its frontier northwards from the Alps and eastwards from the Rhine. Drusus and Tiberius conducted campaigns that bullied and bargained Germanic groups into client relationships. Garrisons, winter camps, and roads followed, while diplomacy played tribes against each other. Augustus appears to have had ambitions to push the Roman boundary to the Elbe, which would shorten supply lines from the Danube and enfold much of northern Germany into the imperial tax and legal system. Success depended on steady pressure, local allies, and the Roman habit of treating the creation of a province as a matter of time. Germanic society did not resemble Rome's municipal network. Power rested in kin groups and shifting coalitions of warrior elites. Leaders built authority through success in raids, the distribution of prestige goods, and the ability to rally followers to a common cause. Rome's presence introduced new incentives. Client chiefs gained weapons and status, while resentful rivals saw treachery in every treaty. The Romans understood that auxiliaries and hostages could steady the frontier, but they underestimated how quickly loyalties could pivot in the forests and bogs beyond their forts. Varus was no fool. He had governed Syria and understood both law and war. In Germania, he sought to extend Roman legal structures, preside over courts, and encourage a settled provincial life. To do this, he relied on guides and allied troops. Among them was Arminius, a Cheruscan noble who had served as an officer in Roman auxiliary cavalry and had been granted citizenship and equestrian rank. Arminius knew Roman drill, Roman marching practice, and Roman assumptions. He also knew the terrain east of the Rhine. While Varus collected taxes and dispensed judgment, Arminius built a coalition that included the Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, and others who decided that the time to strike was when the legions were stretched, the weather foul, and the commander unwary. The legions under Varus were the 17th, 18th, and 19th, accompanied by cavalry and auxiliaries, with their long baggage train and many non-combatants, and their summer campaigning season had passed without major fighting. As the force began to move toward winter quarters on the Rhine, Arminius warned of a local rising and persuaded Varus to divert through rugged country to quell it. The new route threaded narrow forest paths and marshy low ground, rather than the more open track preferred by Roman engineers. The march lengthened into a vulnerable column several miles long. Rain turned the soil to grease and the tracks to rutted gullies. Shields were slick, bowstrings temperamental, and the order of march distorted by broken wagons and fallen trees. The first ambush struck from the cover of trees and thickets. Javelins and arrows fell from short range, followed by rushes against the flanks of the column, where baggage and non-combatants were weakest. Roman officers tried to form companies into defensive clumps, but the ground made tidy maneuvering impossible. The priority became survival until nightfall, and the creation of a fortified camp. The legions hacked a rough perimeter on the nearest height and endured the storm with little chance to reset their lines or recover the wounded. On the second day, the army moved again, hoping to break out into open ground. The same pattern returned. Trees creaked, rain fell, and missiles came from dead ground and reverse slopes. Whenever the Romans attempted to pursue, they found short sprints into glades that ended in tangled roots and sudden ditches, perfect killing grounds for tribesmen used to fighting in close cover. Units became separated. Standards were hard to rally to when visibility was a few yards and noise bounced strangely in the woods. Varus still hoped to reach a more defensible position, and once again, the force sought a camp before darkness. The decisive day came as the column worked along a strip of land squeezed between a hill and marshy ground, a corridor later identified by many scholars with the site at Kalkriese. Here, a low earthen rampart and ditch, built in advance, forced the Romans into a narrow passage. The rampart allowed attackers to throw missiles from a protected line and to sally into the column's side. Auxiliary cavalry could not deploy properly. The heavy infantry could not maintain a shield wall when footing failed, and sudden breaks in the path shattered cohesion. Under this pressure, with officers killed and standards at risk, the legions dissolved into desperate knots of men. Varus is said to have taken his own life rather than be captured. Other senior officers tried to cut through with small groups, some reaching Roman-held positions to the west with news of the catastrophe. Most did not. Standard-bearers buried or hid their eagles to deny them to the enemy, a token of the last duty, protect the honor of the legion even as the legion dies. Not every Roman position east of the Rhine fell. The garrison at Aliso held off attacks and broke out to the west in a disciplined retreat, an episode that shows Roman training could still impose order under stress when the ground favored it. Survivors trickled into the Rhine forts and carried tales that chilled the imperial court. The numbers lost were stark. 3 legions and much of their auxiliary support had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The roll of the lost legion numbers, 17 through 19, was never reissued. The gesture admitted that a fresh stamp could not replace the dead on a standard. News reached Augustus in Rome that a trusted commander had perished and a frontier plan had collapsed. Ancient sources describe the emperor's grief and sleeplessness. The human reaction captures the strategic truth. A frontier that seemed manageable now looked porous. Diplomacy with tribes who had allied with Rome would need to be renegotiated at the point of a spear. The Germanic coalitions had proved they could mass, deceive, and wait for weather and ground to do half their work. Punitive expeditions would be costly and risky. A larger question hung in the background of the immediate response. Should Rome continue the project of pushing to the Elbe? Or should the Rhine become the permanent border in the north? In the years after Augustus died, Tiberius, as emperor, sanctioned new campaigns to restore prestige and take revenge. His adopted son, Germanicus, led large forces across the Rhine between 14 and 16 CE, building bridges, burning enemy settlements, and forcing battles on ground of his choosing. He recovered 2 of the lost eagles, defeated Arminius in set-piece encounters such as Edistavizo and the Angravarian Wall, and extracted prisoners and trophies that eased Roman anger. Yet the logistics cost was high. March columns still faced ambush when the terrain narrowed. Storms at sea wrecked transports along the coast. When Germanicus asked to continue, Tiberius drew a line. He argued that holding the Rhine, consolidating Gaul, and keeping legions for crises elsewhere were wiser than pouring men and treasure into forests that swallowed them. The frontier hardened into roads, watchtowers and forts, the early elements of the limes that would define Rome's northern boundary for centuries. Arminius emerged from the battle as the figure who had outwitted Rome, but his later years show the difficulty of turning tactical success into stable authority. He tried to bind the tribes into a more lasting confederation under his leadership, which provoked jealousy and fear. Rivals accused him of seeking kingship. In the end, his own kin brought him down. He was killed in internal strife, a common fate for war leaders whose prestige depended on continual success and distribution of spoils. Rome's enemies did not need to defeat him. Germanic politics did the work on Rome's behalf. The disaster at Teutoburg Forest was not caused by a single mistake. It was the product of several decisions and conditions that compounded. Intelligence failed at the point where a trusted ally was an architect of betrayal. Reconnaissance and route selection ceded the advantage to the enemy. Varus allowed the column to be encumbered by baggage and non-combatants in terrain that demanded a light, suspicious posture. Separated by weather and terrain, units could not mutually support one another. Command voices and standards could not cut through the noise and trees. When the fighting devolved into isolated struggles, Roman strengths in formation and rotation of frontline cohorts were lost. For the Germanic coalition, the battle was a lesson in preparation and patience. The rampart at a choke point, the timing with rain and mud, the choice of ground where cavalry could not function, and armor became a burden, and the decision to attack a marching column rather than a fortified camp, all favored a lightly equipped force that knew every fold of the land. Arminius used his Roman education ruthlessly, counting on predictability to set his trap. For centuries, antiquarians argued about the precise location of the disaster. Systematic finds at Kalkriese in northwest Germany, including coins stamped with Varus's name, Roman armor fittings, sling bullets, fragments of helmets, and a long earthen rampart, have convinced many that this landscape witnessed one of the key engagements. The distribution of artifacts suggests a fleeing, breaking column rather than a tidy battle line. The rampart shows a prepared position where attackers could fire from cover and drop down upon a constrained path. Excavations have also recovered human remains and evidence of later Roman visits, possibly Germanicus's burials of the dead. The site complements the texts, grounding the narrative in soil and ditch and the ordinary things soldiers carried into their last fight. In later centuries, the battle became a symbol. In the 19th century, as German nationalism grew, Arminius became Hermann, a liberator carved in monumental stone, a sword raised toward the west. The statue at the Hermannsdenkmal near Detmold is not history, it is commemoration. Roman writers had their own agendas, describing barbarians and civilized order in a way that affirmed the empire's identity. Modern scholarship prunes back these layers to ask precise questions about logistics, command, landscape, and the limits of imperial reach. Teutoburg remains a compelling story because it sits where practical military choices meet myths of freedom and empire. The most immediate consequence for Rome was the halt of eastward expansion north of the Alps. Rome continued to raid and exact revenge, but it did not turn Germania Magna into a province. The Rhine became the default line of forts, roads, and patrol zones that shielded Gaul. The empire shifted resources to stabilize that line and strengthen the Danube frontier, where provincial life had firmer foundations. The disaster also reinforced the Roman habit of combining force with careful alliance management. Auxiliaries remained essential, but hostage exchanges, selective patronage, and sharper checks on ambitious client leaders followed. Inside the army, commanders took route choice, reconnaissance, and security more seriously. March discipline and the readiness to fortify nightly camps, even in apparently safe country, were not optional. Germanic societies were also changed. Victory brought prestige goods, weapons, captives, and confidence, but it did not produce a political structure that could match Rome's administrative resilience. Coalitions formed and broke as leaders rose and fell. Contacts with Rome continued, sometimes hostile, sometimes commercial, often both in the same decade. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the frontier would see federate arrangements in which groups settled within the empire in return for service. In that long view, Teutoburg was a dramatic moment in a relationship that did not end with a single defeat or victory. Several lessons endure beyond their ancient setting. Know the ground and let it shape your plan. A commander who chooses a route because a guide insists on it, without independent reconnaissance, hands the enemy the map. Keep columns compact and guarded when visibility is poor. Protect flanks with scouts and pickets rather than trusting to speed. Separate non-combatants and heavy baggage from the point of danger. Above all, assume that an ally who knows your habits also knows how to break them. Arminius turned Roman virtues of routine and confidence into vulnerabilities. Varus, who might have fought a defensive battle if given clear fields and a day to fortify, found himself improvising in a place where improvisation was almost impossible. Visitors to the Kalkriese area today can walk along the reconstructed rampart line and look across the shallow pass between the hill and the bog. It is not an alpine defile, rather a constricted lane that makes sudden sense when you imagine wagons, mules, and terrified civilians pressed into it, while men with shields and javelins strike from a few paces away. Museums display coins, mask fragments from cavalry helmets, and the small, tough objects of military life that outlast flesh and wood. The quiet of the place does not erase the violence it once contained. It clarifies the scale. 3 legions are an abstraction. A few coins with a governor's name and a ditch line cut into sandy soil are proof. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest destroyed 3 Roman legions and a grand plan to push the empire's border to the Elbe. It elevated Arminius as a commander who understood his enemy and the land, and it left Varus as a warning about misplaced trust, bad routes, and overconfidence. In response, Rome raided, recovered honor, and then anchored itself on the Rhine, choosing consolidations over dreams of a province in the deep woods. Teutoburg's power lies in the way its details still speak to soldiers and politicians. Weather, ground, logistics, allies, and deception decided a campaign more surely than ideals or slogans. In that sense, the rain-soaked tracks east of the Rhine remain a classroom for every generation that thinks its machines and certainties are proof against surprise. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Compact Warfare from compactwarfare.com. If you did, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and while you're there, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.